All right, I guess we're set, and I think I'll just jump right into it. Hi, folks. The title of my paper is Coro-Nationalist Solidarity Amidst the COVID-19 Pandemic in India. As the world wallowed in isolation, we witnessed how universal cataclysm created by a microbe can lead to insurmountable solidarity. In times of crisis, we seek to embrace any or all modes of solidarity that are accessible to us. We ache for a glimmer of hope, an iota of aspiration amidst the abysmal. And in doing so, we resort to desperate, often bizarre practices seeking solidarity. I will be looking at two specific solidarity generating episodes initiated in India right at the outset of the coronavirus pandemic by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Before I move on, I want to, spend some time here explaining and giving context. Um, as a display of the nation's gratitude to those working in health and essential services, the Prime Minister, in his first address to the nation, implored the nation to gather on their balconies at 5 p.m. on March 22 to engage community clapping. About a fortnight later, on April 5, 2020, he then declared 9 minutes at 9 p.m., where he appealed to the nation to turn off the lights and light a candle or a diya, which is a traditional lamp usually lit during Diwali, the ones that you see around. He urged the nation to do this as a symbolic gesture to resist the darkness laid by the pandemic. I argue that these episodes that illuminated and echoed through the nation, quite literally, were in fact nationalist practices masked as solidarity calls. I will spend some time showing what unfolded and then move on to discussing and analyzing why this nature of solidarity is problematic. So here's me sharing the screen. Just a couple of settings. Okay, so this was the first solidarity call, that was the Janata curfew, which translates to public curfew, the community clapping. To drive home the point better, I'll play a clip so that we better understand what unfolded in the country. Heads up, guys, it's loud. Well, that was India during the community clapping event. This was the 9 minutes at 9 p.m., the second solidarity call, which was a lights out exercise. Here we have the Prime Minister Modi himself lighting a lamp during the solidarity exercise. Now, before I play this clip, I want to highlight the role of media here. Media becomes extremely crucial during a time of crisis. In the initial days of the pandemic, the culture of television and primetime news was back, as most of the families used to be glued to their television sets to witness and try to understand, right, what was unfolding. This is a live coverage of the 9 minutes at 9 p.m. by one of the most prominent news channels in the country. I have also written verbatim what the news correspondent says, and this captures how the media mediated the image of Modi during the pandemic and sets the tone for the rest of my presentation. While you're looking at this, I'll also ask you to please pay attention to the flashing headlines. Here you go.
The idea was to show symbolism, and the people of my building at least have come here and shown their symbolism, their plea of the Prime Minister. They've listened to the plea of the Prime Minister. This clearly shows that this is a nation that listens to its Prime Minister. They've all.
This is a nation that listens to its Prime Minister. This sets the tone for what I want to argue further. The headlines that we saw, like the Prime Minister lights up an idea, goes on to show that what was essentially supposed to be about the nation's collective resolve during the pandemic was made into a leadership achievement of sorts of the Prime Minister. Another headline by the same news channel was Diya Jalao Bharat Jodo, which literally translates to light a lamp, unite India. So it is subtly propagating that the only way to unite the country during the pandemic is by obeying the Prime Minister. Before we go ahead, I want to acknowledge that solidarities are important. They are almost always evoked at a time of crisis, right? But in this situation, solidarities were fabricated. They were consciously fashioned and were not just performative, but also cosmetic. They were used to mask other important concerns and information about the pandemic that should have been addressed. These episodes in India recorded what Benedict Anderson would call the construction of national genealogies. Now, the Prime Minister's appeals became commandments to be obeyed as they became representative of one's affinity towards the nation. And a failure to do so led to being termed anti national. So the citizens literally performed their nationalism. This brand of nationalism during the pandemic is problematic as it conveniently relies on homogenization of the lived realities and a sort of moral chauvinism, where the citizens were expected to identify themselves morally and also emotionally with the prime minister's plea. And this unique, problematic brand of nationalism is still actively being reaped in, I quote, the collective unconsciousness of the people. Needless to mention, this led to the romanticization of these solidarities that emerged during the pandemic in the country. And this notion of an imagined community was fabricated, as nations or borders is the only common rhetoric that has always proven impactful, right? So it took shape of something like an us versus them narrative, us specifically being the people of India, and them being not just the virus, but the rest of the world tackling the virus. So the whole community clapping episode was, in fact, misleading in a lot of places in the country. I want to mention that while in the throes of the pandemic, it actually, in a lot of places in the country, resulted in group gatherings on streets. Children and people were chanting "Go Corona, go" as if almost cheering it. And there was misleading and pseudoscientific information doing rounds of social media. To give you an instance, something as bizarre as the sound vibrations that were generated during the community clapping would compel the virus to leave. Can you believe it? All of this led to what the print media calls blame everyone, credit Modi rhetoric, thus, uplifting or heralding Modi's brand of nationalism. It is peculiar to witness a democracy as nationalistic. But the democracy in India is more akin to what I quote delegative rather than representational democracy, as Shakuntala Rao points out. So Spinner Hallev contests that democratizing states often rely on solidarities and create a culture of sacrifice. Now, creating this culture of sacrifice is evident, in our use of language when we use phrases like frontline warriors of the COVID-19 to describe health workers and workers in essential services. I want to flag that as someone who has seen her father struggle with the virus and having it myself, I cannot begin to describe the respect and gratitude that I have for people working in health and essential services. The problem here is the creation of a culture pedestalizing sacrifice only through performative solidarities. This whole idea of evoking national identity by the creation of solidarity becomes a source of inequality, as the significant members of society face discrimination. Sometimes solidarity exercise become accessible only to a specific part of the group, right? Although this was branded as a nation building exercise, during crisis, it was specifically catered to the middle class or the bourgeois Hindu population of the country, who are also often the primary target groups while choosing the government since they're the majority. While talking about the middle class demographic, even in the middle class demographic, any person belonging to several other minority communities were compelled to engage these solidarity calls. It was an enforced nationalism. One of my closest friends, who's Muslim, mentioned how participating in such events becomes a result of an underlying fear and paranoia to constantly prove their national eligibility. We have to understand that India is a huge country with a myriad of people belonging to various social groups, castes, class, religion, and universalizing solidarity without considering these intersectional lived realities is a deterring experience and is detrimental to the national fabric itself. When Modi addressed the nation on March 19, 2020, the first time after the pandemic, there was an inexplicable furor around his address, which lasted for a few of his subsequent addresses as well. Every time the Prime Minister intimated about addressing the nation, or at least initially during the pandemic, the nation waited with bated breath and anxiety filled anticipation for this address. The Week reported that his first address, that was about 30 minutes long, was watched by 83 million people across 192 channels. I want to take a moment here to address that yes, it also stemmed from the fact that the people were just desperately waiting for the Prime Minister to finally address them in the middle of the pandemic. But it was also accelerated due to the pre existing solidarity revolving around Modi's followers. It is this devotion for him that elevated the frenzy encircling his addresses to the nation amidst the pandemic. And the main political implications of this is based in what Christoph Yafrelot calls a new cybernetic populism that lays itself in personalization of power, bases itself in a Hindu nationalist fold, so it perpetuates a culture of demagogy and a relentless presentation of Modi as both a global leader and a commoner who unapologetically identifies only with his target demographic, the majority. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that his brand of nationalism predates this crisis, and his solidarity calls during the pandemic, however flawed, were achieved primarily owing to this pre existing devotion for him. Having said all of this paper does not claim to understand what has happened. It gives an alternative perspective of what transpired in India at the outset of the coronavirus pandemic. Looking back, turning a critical gaze, reviewing these solidarity seeking events. Our realities are speedily shifting, efforts are being made to make sense of it and read meaning into it. And since it's a highly panic ridden time, it is imperative to employ a critical gaze more than ever before. I recently chanced upon a New Yorker article by Katie Waldman that addressed a world in which, and I quote, an intelligent pandemic ravages a planet and destroys itself in the process. Well, one can only hope that the latter part is true. In the meantime, we're still living it. All our experiences are so unique and so different. And what I discussed today is probably a new dimension to the spectrum for a lot of people here, which is why I find myself at a serious lack at raising any discussion questions. I would be willing to engage any questions, comments, concerns that you have about the presentation. Thank you for being so patient with me, and I will see you on the 23rd. Okay.